Hey everyone, welcome back to another tier list. I have been extremely excited to make this one. Today we are going to be going through the discography of the amazing vocalist and songwriter Scott Walker. I had a very interesting introduction to Scott Walker, as I'm sure some of you may have as well, but a friend of mine who recommends me a lot of albums had told me to check out Scott 4, which was the first album of Scott's that I had heard, and I listened to it and I really enjoyed it, but I didn't explore any of his other works for a few months after hearing it. And then I was watching a YouTube video of The Needle Drop talking about some of the most depressing albums of all time, and Scott's album The Drift had popped up. And I've always been a big fan of dark and depressing music, so I figured I would check that one out. And as you can probably guess, when the opening track came on, I was completely thrown off, and it just blew my mind. And it really piqued my curiosity and made me want to go through his entire discography from beginning to end to see how his music would evolve from Scott 1 all the way up to Bish Bosh. And going through Scott's albums has been such an incredible journey and a real trip that is so unique and completely different from any other artist that you will ever listen to. And I would put Scott down as one of the most innovative, daring, and ambitious artists of all time. And he is a great example of somebody who completely stays true to their craft no matter what anybody else thinks of it. And because of that, he has created some of the most mind-bending music that I've ever heard in my life. So we're going to go through his 14 studio albums from Scott 1 up to Bish Bosh, and I'll score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. And I'm going to be sticking to just solo albums and leaving out soundtracks and collaborations, so just a heads up about that. But please let me know your thoughts. I'm sure there will be a lot of agreement and maybe some disagreement here and there, but that's part of the fun. So please let me know what you think in the comments and where your rankings differ from mine. I would love to hear your takes. And yeah, that's about it. Let's jump right into it. All right, we will start out with his debut studio album from 1967 titled Scott, also commonly referred to as Scott 1. And I'm going to give this one an A. This is a very good first release, and some people might be surprised that I'm not giving it an S, but I do think that there are some stronger albums that will follow this one. It came out 6 months after the Walker Brothers' third album, Images, which would end up being their last album together for 8.5 years until the release of No Regrets in 1975. And stylistically, this album has a couple of different elements going on. We have a handful of Scott's originals, as well as a few movie songs, a couple of contemporary covers of the time, and we have a few English translated covers of Belgian singer and songwriter Jacques Brel, who was a profound influence on Scott. For instrumentation and arrangements, we have a couple of different people at play. We have Angela Morley on 5 tracks, who would continue to also be on Scott 2, 3, and 4, and we also have Reg Guest, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and Peter Knight doing arrangements for the remainder of the tracks. We also have some amazing production from John Franz, who had produced the Walker Brothers' first 3 releases and would be the sole producer of Scott's first 8 albums. And I really love what he did on this one with the Phil Spector Wall of Sound. Definitely a sound that we had heard on some Walker Brothers tracks like The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore. And I think that style of production worked particularly well with the song selection from this album. In terms of songs, I generally think that the track listing is very strong on this album. I tend to resonate the most with Scott's originals as well as the Jacques Brel selections. To me, those are the highest points from this album, but I don't mind the other selections as well, and there's only like one track on here that I'm not really crazy about, which we will get to. I really love the way it opens. We start with a beautiful rendition of the Jacques Brel song Matilda, which brings the album in with such a great drive and energy, with a huge sounding brass section and Scott's amazing vocal work. Easily one of the standout tracks on this album for me. And then it's followed up very nicely with an original from Scott titled Montague Terrace, a very pretty track that starts out more mellow with these pretty atmospheric orchestral backdrops, and then it picks up the dynamics and intensity for the second section with the brass and rhythm section picking things up a bit. A very dreamy and very pretty first original track to include on the album, and I love that it comes in so early on. I love that right after track 1 they hit us with an original from Scott's. And then after that we have a cover of a beautiful love song called Angelica, a very epic and passionate song with this lush orchestration and arrangements backing Scott, and I particularly love Scott's voice in the chorus of this song. It's just so hard-hitting and heartfelt, just so beautiful. And then after the first 3 tracks, we have the one song from this album that I don't care about. It's a cover of a country song by Tim Hardin titled The Lady Came Back from Baltimore. And this has always been the one track that does take away a little momentum on side 1 for me. Stylistically, I just don't find it as engaging or exciting as the first 3 tracks that we had just heard. And just for my own preferences, I don't always resonate as much with the country sides of Scott Walker's work. But then after that, we have a beautiful rendition of a jazz ballad titled When Joanna Loved Me. Scott's voice is so serene on this one. I love his vibrato, and in general, I love his vocal phrasing over the jazz covers that he does. They're always very tasteful, and he's just got such a great sense of rhythm. And then after that, side 1 concludes with an eerie Jacques Brel song titled My Death, which looks at death through a variety of different lenses. A really great song and one of my all-time favorite Jacques Brel covers that Scott does, and just an awesome and haunting way to conclude side 1. Side 2 opens up with another jazzier cover called The Big Hurt. This is a pretty song. I really like the orchestration, and the vocal melody is very colorful. And then we go into Such a Small Love, which is hands down my favorite Scott original on here. Definitely the most experimental, with the eerie violin parts as the backdrop to the first section. And that's a technique that I think is very unique to Scott, and it's something that we will hear him utilize on a lot of songs on future records. And I really love the contrasting second section, which is more driving and some heavier instrumentation. Just an amazing track, and easily one of my favorites on here. After that, we have 2 movie soundtrack songs with You're Gonna Hear From Me and Through a Long and Sleepless Night. I can sort of do without You're Gonna Hear From Me. It's definitely my least favorite song on side 2, but I really like Through a Long and Sleepless Night. Absolutely beautiful instrumental writing and so many great background parts, and the orchestration is just top notch. Then we have another great Scott original titled Always Coming Back to You. I really love the contrast between the 2 main sections. Section 1 being a bit more mysterious, and then section 2 becomes much more colorful and serene. All 3 of the originals on here are very unique and different from one another, and it's so great getting to see the genius of Scott Walker as a composer coming into fruition more and more through these couple of original songs that he contributed to his first 2 albums. And then side 2 concludes with another Jacques Brel cover titled Amsterdam. This one is much different stylistically and probably sounds the most similar to an original Jacques Brel recording with the accordion. And some people might be surprised by this, but I'm actually not that crazy about this track. At least of the Brel covers that are on here, this is definitely my least favorite. But I wouldn't say that it's a bad song. I just don't find it as engaging as Matilda or My Death. And it's kind of just a song that I have to be in a specific mood to listen to. But all in all, I think it is a very fun and consistent album with only a few dips here and there. But I enjoy all 3 of Scott's originals, and I think the majority of the covers on here are very tasteful and offer the listener a nice diverse palette of different kinds of songs. So a great debut album from Scott. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have his second studio album from 1968 titled Scott 2. I'm also going to give this one an A. I really enjoy this album, and I would even consider it a slight improvement on Scott 1. But like I said with Scott 1, I do think that he does have stronger future albums that for me would be more fitting to put in S tier. But regardless, this is still a very good album, and it follows a very similar outline to Scott 1. We have John Franz using the Wall of Sound production again, and we have a similar song selection with 3 Jacques Brel covers, 4 Scott originals, as well as a couple of contemporary covers and a couple of film songs. It opens up with another very powerful and high-energy Jacques Brel cover titled Jackie, another perfect track to start out with, and a song that takes on a very similar style and mood to Matilda from Scott 1. Really amazing opener. And then we take the tempo down a bit with a beautiful cover of Best of Both Worlds. Once again, a perfect song choice that Scott's voice just shines over and sounds so beautiful against the orchestration and that Wall of Sound production. And then after that, we have another Tim Hardin cover called Black Sheep Boy. And fortunately, I do like this song a lot more than Lady Came from Baltimore. So another reason why I think this album is an upgrade from Scott 1. And then we have Scott's first original, which comes in a little bit later on this album, whereas with Scott 1, we had original song right on track 2. but this one is called The Amorous Humphrey Plug, another really amazing Scott original, and pretty much every original that he contributed to his first two releases I love. And then we have another Brel cover titled Next, which is probably the most edgy song on the album, lyric-wise, talking about stuff like losing your virginity in an army whorehouse and all sorts of sexual themes to it, and definitely a lot of humorous elements as well. I love the marimba parts on this one, and the overall vibe is just very cool and eerie and a nice change of pace from everything that we've heard up to this point. Then side one wraps up with a Scott original titled The Girl from the Streets, another song that starts out much more mellow and chill, and then it picks up the energy and intensity for the second section. I love the beautiful background vocals as well as the accordion feature, which definitely gives this one a bit more of a Jacques Brel sort of flavor to it. And then side two opens up with my favorite ska original from his first two albums, Plastic Palace People. To me, this song completely encompasses all of my favorite elements of Scott Walker's writing, between that very magical and majestic mood of the music, as well as the very vivid imagery that his lyrics can paint for the listener. The instrumental part of the opening section is one of the most magical things I've ever heard. The different parts going on between the violins, the piano, and the harp create such rich and beautiful textures, and Scott's vocals on top of it evoke so much of that beautiful imagery that I was talking about. And then the second and third sections enter and provide even more beautiful depth to the song. I particularly love the delayed vocal parts on the third section, very psychedelic effect. And the way that these three different parts just dance in between one another create the most magical 6 minutes of this entire album, in my opinion. I cannot say enough good things about that song. After that, we have a film song done as a ballad called Wait Until Dark. This is a pretty song, but it is another one of those tracks that I do need to be in a certain mood to listen to. And I'd say I feel even more so about the next track, which is another Jacques Brel cover called The Girls and the Dogs. Definitely a catchy song with a humorous mood to it, but it is something that I'm not always in the mood to listen to compared to some of the other tracks on this album. But then after that, we have my favorite cover on here, an amazing rendition of Burt Bacharach and Hal David's Windows of the World. Such a beautiful and heart-wrenching interpretation from Scott, and in general, I always love any time Scott covers a Burt Bacharach song. I think that his track record with those song choices is incredibly strong and speaks for itself. And then we have another original of Scott titled The Bridge. This is a down-tempo love song, and again, it has the beautiful lyrics that paint so much vivid imagery in your head. And this would be my second favorite original on here after Plastic Palace People. It's just such a pretty song. And in all honesty, I always had wished that the album ended on this track, because I think the final track is another one of those songs that I need to be in a certain mood for. It's a cover of a film song titled Come Next Spring. Not a bad song, but compared to a lot of the other stuff on here, this is one of the songs that does stand out to me the least, and I think that The Bridge would have been a much more powerful conclusion to the album, ending it on a bit more of a dark and mysterious tone to set up Scott 3. But regardless of that, like I said, I do think that this album is an improvement upon Scott 1, featuring 4 originals instead of 3. I enjoy the Tim Hardin cover more on this one as well. And like I said, it does have a few tracks that I need to be in a specific mood to listen to, but I think for the most part, this album is very consistent and once again offers us a nice diverse palette of sounds and styles from Scott Walker. So a very good follow-up album. I will also give this one an A. Okay, now we have his third studio album from 1969 titled Scott 3. This one gets an easy S. And this is actually my favorite Scott Walker album. I cannot get enough of this one. And at this point in Scott's career, he had made the decision to write original songs for almost the entirety of this album. We have 13 tracks, and the first 10 are originals, and then he concludes the album with 3 Jacques Brel covers. And to me, those magical sounding elements to his music and that very vivid imagery that we get from his lyrics, I think are really at a peak throughout this album. I've always considered this to be Scott's most magical and majestic sounding sounding album from beginning to end. Between his songwriting, his beautiful vocal work and melodies, as well as the amazing arrangements and instrumentation, which I think is a huge component in this album, with so much variety and beautiful choices for different instruments throughout. And right from the opening track, he establishes that daring and adventurous direction that this album will take with the song It's Raining Today. It starts out with these really eerie and atonal violin clusters that are just getting held out, and then he brings in this very peaceful and serene vocal and instrumental part, but the strings are still going in the background throughout, creating this very haunting dichotomy that just sounds so cool and so original. Making this the opening track of the album is probably the coolest thing that Scott could have done, in my opinion. And then after that, we have my favorite track from the album titled Copenhagen. I think this is one of Scott's most beautiful songs ever written, and the instrumental section at the end is, in my opinion, one of the most magical sounding instrumental moments of any Scott Walker song. I can listen to that section over and over and over again on repeat and just never get sick of it, and can bring tears to my eyes. It's so beautiful. Then we have Rosemary, another beautiful track with two great contrasting sections. Section 1 is more stripped down with just vocals and strings, and then the drums enter for section 2, and it just feels so nice when everything comes in together. Then we bring things down a bit with Big Louise, a very mellow and sad song. I really love the string arrangements, and Scott's vocal phrasing on this one is so pretty, and I love his time feel, just effortlessly floating over that slow tempo. And then the energy picks back up with We Came Through. I've always enjoyed this song, and I really like the energy boost after the first 4 more mellow tracks. This song has a very military feel to it with the marching snare and the brass section. It's got a really great drive to it, and Scott's vocal melody is so catchy. And then after that, we have, in my opinion, another one of the most beautiful songs on the album titled Butterfly. Between the harp and the flute at the beginning and Scott's lyrics, this is another song that evokes so much imagery for me, and the instrumentation really creates the perfect aesthetic for a butterfly flying around in the wind. Just another very magical song. And then side 1 concludes with one of my favorite tracks on here, Two Ragged Soldiers. This is a very emotional and touching ballad that is sort of a commentary on homeless people and the idea that at one point in their life they were young and full of hopes and dreams. Very sad song, and the perfect conclusion to side 1 in my opinion. Then we open up side 2 with 30th Century Man. Definitely a change of pace from everything else that we've heard up to this point, and this is probably the one song on here that I would say is the most different from everything else. It's just Scott strumming his guitar and singing for about a minute and a half, and he is talking about the idea of a man being able to freeze himself and leave centuries into his future. I don't mind this song, and it is cool hearing Scott in this sort of environment, but I will say this is probably my least favorite track on the album. And I know some people are going to consider that blasphemy. People love this song. But just for me, in comparison to everything else on here, this is probably the track that stands out to me the least. But I wouldn't say it's a bad song. I've just always considered it to be like the odd man out on this album. But then after that, we get back into the magical, dreamy realm with Winter Night, a shorter track that does a really great job of evoking imagery of a snowy night. And once again, the use of the harp adds such a nice layer of depth to the song. And then that is followed by the last original track on the album, a down-tempo love song called 2 Weeks Since You've Gone. Another beautiful and dreamy song with some really poetic vocal work from Scott. And then the album concludes with a great selection of 3 Jacques Brel covers with Sons of, Funeral Tango, and If You Go Away. I really love the toy piano in Sons of. It creates such an innocent and childlike mood, and in general the piano work throughout this song is very pretty and a nice change of pace from the very string-heavy songs that we had heard up to this point. The song builds beautifully, and I love how it gradually keeps adding instruments to the song to eventually lead to a really full and epic ending. And then we have Funeral Tango. This song is very interesting because it's very upbeat, but it also has this dark humor element in the lyrics where they are talking about a funeral and the superficial nature of some of the people that go there to gossip and find out about the person's will rather than to be there for genuine and authentic reasons. I think this song has a great energy to it, and I really like how it sets up the final track If You Go Away, a very pretty and sad ballad, and the only song on this album that was actually recorded 2 years prior and not written with the intention of it being on this album. But I think it is a very powerful and dark song to close out on, and putting this at the end after Funeral Tango was a great choice and a very fitting mood for the conclusion. So like I said, I think this is one of the most magical albums of all time. It doesn't have a bad track, and it definitely established Scott Walker's new sound and his daringness to push the envelope and write whatever he felt was most genuine to who he was as a person. And fortunately for him, this album did reach number 3 in the British album chart and gave him the confidence to continue on this trend and bring us Scott 4. But we do have a slight detour before we get to that album. But yeah, amazing piece of work. And like I said, my number 1 favorite Scott Walker album. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have his 4th studio album from 1969, which is actually not Scott 4, it is Scott Walker Sings Songs from his TV series. Full disclosure, this is going to be one of 3 albums on this list that I have not heard in their entirety because they are virtually impossible to find full versions of online. Because of Scott's dissatisfaction, it resulted in him blocking any CD re-releases of this album, as well as the albums The Moviegoer and Any Day Now. So none of those 3 have ever been reissued, and the only options are to buy rare, expensive copies of them on eBay, or you can listen to the majority of the albums on YouTube with a couple of tracks missing from each of them. And that is the case with this album. You can find 10 of the 12 tracks on YouTube. The 2 missing ones are Will You Still Be Mine and The Song Is You. So I will just do the review based on the 10 tracks that I am able to hear. Now, in terms of what I think of this album, I actually really enjoy this one. I'm going to give this an A, and I'm actually surprised at Scott's dissatisfaction with this one. And I think because I knew that, I went in expecting it to be much worse than it was. But I would say that I was pleasantly surprised with this album. This one takes a slight detour from the types of sounds that Scott had been developing from Scott 1 up to Scott 3, and it doesn't feature any original songs. It has a collection of ballads and jazz standards that Scott had performed on his short-lived BBC TV series titled Scott. And although it doesn't feature any originals, I thought the song selection was great, and I thoroughly enjoyed hearing Scott singing over these types of songs. It reminded me of like a Frank Sinatra type of album of jazz covers, but hearing Scott's interpretations and vocal inflections over it was a real treat, and it really showed the versatility of his voice. For the song selection, we have about half ballads and half mid-tempo standards, and that's the general 2 feels that the album bounces between. For ballads, we have When the World Was Young, If She Walked Into My Life, Country Girl, Only the Young, and Lost in the Stars. And for the mid-tempo tracks, we have I Have Dreamed, Who Will Take My Place, Someone to Light Up My Life, and an absolutely beautiful rendition of The Look of Love. Instrumentation-wise, some of the tracks feature really beautiful piano accompaniment, and others have nylon string guitar, and we have a great orchestra backing him up featuring string arrangements, as well as a brass and woodwind section. And in general, I think the album is very consistent, at least of the 10 tracks that I am able to hear. I don't dislike a single one of the tracks. I think this album has a really great vibe to it. It's great to be able to hear Scott shine in an environment like this. And to me, this is the kind of album that is perfect to put on when you're having a nice dinner and you want to set a nice chill mood. I was doing some cooking a while ago, and I had this album playing in the background, and it was just the most perfect atmosphere that I could have asked for. So if you haven't done that, I would recommend trying that out. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I will say that I don't like it as much as Scott 1 or Scott 2, just to clarify, since they are in the same tier. But I definitely don't think that it is a huge downgrade, and I wouldn't have felt right putting it in B tier. So although I do like Scott 1 and 2 better, I think this is a very fun and very tasteful album that shows us a little bit of a different side of Scott and offers us some really beautiful renditions of some classic jazz songs. So great album. I will give this one an A. Okay, now we get to his 5th album and the concluding album of the series of 4 Scott albums, Scott 4 from 1969. Obviously, I'm going to give this one an S. Absolutely amazing album. And a lot of people regard this as his best album, which is why when I said Scott 3 was my favorite, I thought a couple of people might be surprised to hear that. But I think both of these albums are amazing and different from one another in their own respects. I think this album does a great job of retaining some of those elements from Scott 3 with the magical orchestral arrangements, but at the same time, this is not an album that is completely centered around that. Angela Morley had only done arrangements for 2 of the tracks on this album, so we have some of those elements, but we also have some tracks that are more drum heavy, more guitar and bass, and in general just some more rock elements happening throughout this album, and it certainly provides a very enjoyable journey from track to track. It opens up with a very hard-hitting and driving track called The Seventh Seal, which is written about the 1957 movie of the same name. Very cool way to open the album, and a completely different vibe from It's Raining Today. So like I said, they have a really nice contrast from one another. And then he follows it up with a beautiful love song and probably my favorite track on the album, titled On Your Own Again. In my opinion, this song has some of Scott's most beautiful vocal melodies, and I love the way it picks up the energy halfway through and then it brings it back down again. And then after that, we have another really pretty love song. This one is called The World's Strongest Man, and this one has a drum groove going throughout with an organ and beautiful string backgrounds. Very catchy too. I definitely get the chorus of this song stuck in my head a lot. And then after that, we have 2 songs which give us a sound more similar to what we heard on Scott 3 with Angels of Ashes and Boy Child. Both incredible songs, and I really love the placement of both of these, wrapping up side 1 on more of that majestic and euphoric sound, particularly with Boy Child, another one of the standout tracks from this album. And when I first listened to this album, like I said at the beginning of the video, this was the first Scott Walker album that I ever listened to, and Boy Child was definitely the main song that really caught my ear initially after listening to this. So a really amazing conclusion to side 1. And then side 2 opens up with 2 very political tracks, Hero of the War and The Old Man's Back Again, with each of them telling a perspective of the Cold War from the American side as well as the Russian side. And The Old Man's Back Again is probably the most popular song off of this album and considered a Scott Walker classic. It's got such a catchy vocal melody, and the song has such a great groove to it, particularly in the bass. One of the tastiest bass lines of any Scott Walker song, in my opinion. Then we have Duchess, which is sort of like a pop ballad, a very pretty song, and probably stylistically the most different from everything else on this album, opening up with the pedal steel guitar, giving us a little hint of country. And then after that, we have by far the most rocking song from the album, titled Get Behind Me. We have distorted guitar that comes in during the chorus with this driving drum and bass groove and female backing vocals. A very cool sound and interesting to hear, but I will say that this is another track similar to what I said about a few of the tracks on Scott 1 and Scott 2, where I do need to be in a specific mood to listen to it. Sometimes this can be a skip over track for me when I'm listening to this album, so that's probably another one of the reasons why I lean more towards Scott 3. And then the album concludes with Rhymes of Goodbye, a song that takes on a slightly more country flavor and a surprising choice to wrap up the album with. But it's a very pretty song and much more upbeat than the concluding track from Scott 3. So like I said at the beginning, if I am more in the mood for a nice stylistic variety of different Scott Walker songs, I'll put this album on. But if I'm more in that dreamy sort of mood where I just want to listen to something that brings me to another world and keeps kind of the same vibe for the majority of it, I'll always go with Scott 3 for that. And unfortunately, this album failed to chart, which would eventually lead Scott to take a detour in his career into some different territories that people weren't expecting, and actually retire from songwriting for a significant chunk of time. But we still have one more album before that change will take place. But yeah, amazing album, another one that gets an easy S. Okay, next we have his 6th studio album from 1970 titled Till the Band Comes In. This album seems like it is very often overlooked in Scott's discography. I've noticed a lot of different people that will tell the story about Scott Walker and his evolution as a songwriter, and for whatever reason, a lot of people seem to gloss over this album and just talk about Scott 1 through 4 and then the subsequent cover albums that would follow it without any mention of this album. But he did have one album left in him before he retired from songwriting, and that was this one. So for scoring, I'm going to give this one an A. I do enjoy a lot of this album, but I will say that I don't think it is as strong as Scott 1 or Scott 2, but I do think it has some great tracks and offers us a few more awesome Scott Walker originals before his fade into obscurity in the early 70s. We have 10 originals followed by 5 cover songs, and apparently the originals are meant to be a cycle of songs about the lives of a variety of different people. And I love how it starts out. We have this very beautiful and open sounding string prologue that connects us very nicely into track 2, titled Little Things That Keep Us Together. An absolutely amazing track to bring the album in with this great energy, a superb orchestra really driving the song, and Scott's beautiful harmonized vocal parts, and the lyrical matters, which seem to be commenting on all sorts of horrific things that happen to people. So a very interesting contrast to the mood of the song, because when you really pay attention to the lyrics, they are surprisingly dark. And I think this is one of the best songs on the album, in my opinion. A perfect opener. Then we have a track called Joe, which is another contrasting song where the mood is very laid back and jazzy, but the lyrics talk about a guy named Joe coming to terms with different elements of his life as he is dying. Very intense lyrically, but instrumentally it's very mellow. And then after that, we have one of the singles from the album, Thanks for Chicago, Mr. James. Such a beautiful and catchy song, and I think this pairs really nicely with the first 2 tracks of side 1, and I could even picture a song like this being back on Scott 1 or Scott 2. It definitely gives me some hints of that. And then that is followed by an absolutely beautiful ballad sung by Esther Oferim titled Long About Now. And this song, to me, has a lot of similarities to Scott 3, with the beautiful orchestration and the spacey nature of these kinds of ballads. I really love Esther's feature as well. Her voice is absolutely beautiful and complements the song very nicely. And then we have a fascinating song called Time Operator, which alternates between these 2 different sections. We start with this really spacey string part underneath the vocal melody, and the opening vocal parts in this song has always reminded me of some of the types of melodies that he would sing on his later album, Climate of Hunter. But then there's this other jazzy element to it where the drums come in and provide a really interesting contrast. But then after that, unfortunately, side 1 wraps up with my 2 least favorite tracks from this side, with Gene the Machine and Cowbells Shakin'. Gene the Machine is very upbeat and almost circus-like, and I've just never resonated with this song. And then Cowbell Shakin' is this short, 1-minute long acoustic guitar and vocal track that I've just never really been that intrigued by. But then after that, side 2 opens up very nicely with the title track, Till the Band Comes In. Amazing song with such a massive sound, especially when the chorus comes in, and very cool rhythmic ideas with the drum beat going off of the vocal part in the chorus. Very cool writing, and a song to me that just gives us that classic Scott Walker sound, something that I could have also pictured being on Scott 1 or 2. And then after that, we have the final original and my favorite track on the album by far, titled Epilogue, The War Is Over. Such a magical and dreamy song, and Scott's vocal melody over this is absolutely amazing. He hits so many colorful notes, and the orchestration just complements everything so nicely. And I think that this song is the perfect final original track that he could have placed on this album. For the remaining 5 songs, we have all covers, and I don't mind a few of them, but there are a couple that I'm not crazy about. And I'm sure a third of the album being covers could definitely be one of the reasons why a lot of people overlooked this album, but that's just my hunch. I don't mind the first cover, Stormy, it's okay. I really like the second one, The Hills of Yesterday. And the third one is my least favorite song on the album by far, Reuben James. And unfortunately, this is a country cover that is a precursor of what is to come in the following years. And then for the last 2, we have a ballad called What Are You Doing the Rest of Your Life, followed by an acoustic track called It's Over. Both of these songs are okay, but I wouldn't say that I think they are some of the most exciting songs from the album. I think a good chunk of side 1 is really good, and then side 2 gives us the final 2 originals, which are both amazing, followed by a couple of decent covers and a country cover that I don't care for. So this album has always been kind of all over the place for me, but I don't think it's a bad album by any stretch, and I think it offers us a really nice handful of really beautiful Scott Walker tracks to conclude this phase of his career. So this one gets an A. Alright, next we have his 7th studio album from 1972 titled The Moviegoer. This is one of 4 albums that Scott would release in the early 70s that contain no original material and focused more on covers to see if they could produce some more commercial success after Scott 4 and Till the Band Comes In had failed to chart. And each of these 4 albums would vary slightly in styles, but this album consists entirely of movie themes. And this is another one of those albums where I haven't been able to hear it in its entirety. I've heard 9 of the 12 songs, so I will just rank it based on what I have heard on YouTube. And I'm going to give this one a B. I was actually pretty torn with what score to give this album because I actually do like a lot of this album, and I don't dislike any of the 9 tracks that I heard, but at the same time I wouldn't say that I like it as much as Scott 1 or Scott 2 or even Till the Band Comes In. So putting it in A tier with those albums felt a little bit weird, but at the same time I don't think this is a bad album by any means. It's got some really beautiful song choices that really complement Scott's vocals very nicely and really allow his voice to shine. We have some beautiful orchestrations as well that give me some hints of Scott 1 through Scott 4 in terms of the instrumentation and the backdrop for a lot of these songs, with tracks like This Way Mary, That Night, The Summer Knows, Loss of Love, and Come Saturday Morning. I also really like how he threw in Speak Softly Love from The Godfather, as well as the theme to Sacco and Vanzetti, both pleasant surprises to hear on this album. And I also love how the album wraps up on a nice jazzy note with Easy Come, Easy Go. It's really nice hearing Scott's vocals with a jazz piano trio. Very tasteful. So in general, I don't think that this album is terrible at all. I wouldn't say that it has great replay value compared to everything else that we've talked about up to this point, but I wouldn't say that this album is so bad that it needed to be blocked from ever getting re-released. I think, like I said, it has a really nice batch of movie themes and allows us to hear Scott singing in a different kind of environment, and his vocals sound amazing over it. And in general, I just don't think this album is as bad as some people say it is. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have his 8th studio album from 1973 titled Any Day Now. This is the final album on this list that I have not heard in its entirety. I have heard 8 of the 11 songs on YouTube, so once again, I will score it based on what I have been able to hear. And I'm going to give this one a B as well. Once again, I don't mind this album, and I think it has some really beautiful song selections. Similar to the previous release, we have all cover songs. And stylistically, this album is hard to categorize into one specific genre, but it does have some pop elements to it, as well as some jazz and easy listening, and a very slight touch of country, but definitely not as much as the albums that would follow this one. Side 1 has a couple of tracks that I really enjoy, specifically the opening track, which is the title track, Any Day Now, which is an amazing song written by Burt Bacharach and Bob Hilliard. And once again, I think anytime Scott does a Burt Bacharach track, it always comes out really beautifully. I also really enjoyed his cover of Do I Love You, as well as the final 2 tracks of Side 1, which are a Randy Newman cover called Cowboy and a Barry Mann cover called Right When You Get Down to It. For Side 2, I can't find the opening 2 tracks anywhere, but the remaining 3 tracks I think are all nice, particularly the Me I Never Knew. I especially love the instrumentation on that one. And with the final track, We Could Be Flying, I really love how it opens up with that really dissonant piano and orchestral part, which definitely reminded me of something that could have been found on future Scott Walker albums, which was really cool to hear and very unexpected. But yeah, in general, I really don't mind this album. Granted, I would much prefer an album of new Scott Walker originals, but for being an album of covers, I don't think the song selection on this one was that bad, and I wish I was able to find the other 3 tracks somewhere because I think I would be able to have a better idea of how I truly felt about it, but based off of the 8 songs that I was able to hear, I'll give this one a B. Okay, next we have his 9th studio album from 1973 titled Stretch. I'm going to give this one a C. I've always had a bit of a harder time with this one compared to the previous two. This one features all covers once again, and stylistically, this one is much more in the country realm, with a couple of tracks here and there that veer off from that. But I'm not a huge country guy, so I think stylistically I just have a harder time with this album. I will say though that I still do think this album has a good chunk of songs that are very pretty, and I think Scott's voice translates really nicely over to these different styles and shows the versatility of him as a vocalist. And although I'm not a huge country guy, a couple of the country choices on here I actually didn't mind, particularly with the opening track, which is a Mickey Newberry cover titled Sunshine. It's a really pretty breakup song with these great pedal steel guitar lines complementing the vocals really nicely. And then I don't mind track 2 as well. It is a beautiful Randy Newman ballad titled Just One Smile, a really nice heartfelt song, and I love the piano part and the beautiful strings, and Scott's vocals are very pretty. Definitely one of my favorite songs on the album, and a great follow-up to the opening track. So up to this point, I don't think it is that bad of an album, but after that we have two tracks that don't really do much for me, with A Woman Left Lonely and No Easy Way Down. I do find both of these songs to be kind of underwhelming and sort of like skip-over tracks in comparison to the first two. But then we end side 1 with a nice Tom T. Hall cover titled That's How I Got to Memphis, another country cover that I find a little bit more tolerable. And then after that, side 2 opens up with a cover of the Bill Withers song Use Me. And while I don't mind this cover, I do think this is sort of the odd man out stylistically on this album. It definitely veers off from the general mood that was established on side 1, as well as the remainder of side 2, and I think this album could have done just without this song. And soul and R&B isn't really a style that I'm very interested in hearing Scott do, but obviously his vocals are always going to sound great regardless of what style that he does. And then for the remainder of side 2, I have very similar feelings that I did with side 1. There are a couple of tracks that I think are really nice, like Someone Who Cared, a really beautiful heartfelt ballad written by the producer Del Newman, probably my favorite track on here. And to me, this is probably the closest song to having some sort of resemblance to 60s Scott Walker. And the two others that I enjoy are the Jimmy Webb cover, Where Does Brown Begin? And then the final track of the album, another Randy Newman cover called I'll Be Home, which is another really beautiful ballad, adds a really nice touch to the conclusion of the album. But in general, I would say this is a downgrade from everything we've heard up to this point. I enjoy about half of this album, but I don't always like where it started to go stylistically. But I do think the Randy Newman covers are sort of the saving grace of this album. So yeah, not a great album, but I wouldn't say it's horrible. So this one gets a C. Okay, next we have his 10th studio album from 1974 titled We Had It All. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to give this one a D. I've tried and listened to this album a handful of times, but I do really have a hard time with this one. This is by far the most country of any of his albums, and I'm very glad that this was his last album within that trajectory. And all of my critiques of this album really have nothing to do with Scott or his vocal work. I just think the song selection on this one is pretty weak. And of all four of his cover albums from the 70s, this album has the least amount of songs that resonate with me stylistically. With the previous album Stretch, we had some of that country material, but I found the song selections from that one much more tolerable than this one. And I think just listening to the opening track on Stretch compared to the opening track on this album really articulate the differences in the types of country songs that were chosen for each album. And I honestly can't say that there are any songs on this album that I like, but if I had to pick a couple that are the most tolerable to me, I would say that I don't mind the Jerry Reed cover titled You're Young and You'll Forget. And also the Gordon Lightfoot cover of Sundown is tolerable, but I really dislike all of the Billy Joe Shaver covers on here, and unfortunately he does 4 of them. And with the previous album, we had that country material, but it was also balanced out with some Randy Newman songs, as well as the Del Newman original that I liked. So I think the variety and the song selection from the previous release made it slightly more tolerable than this one, and unfortunately this is my least favorite Scott Walker album. But luckily, once we get past this album, Scott takes a complete shift into something that is so new and so exciting. So not a great album, in my opinion. I will give this one a D. Okay, next we have his 11th album from 1984 titled Climate of Hunter. This album had a lot of anticipation behind it due to the fact that it would be the first album of original music under Scott's own name that he had done since 1970. And other than that, the only other original material that we had heard by Scott up to this point was the 4 tracks that he had written for the final Walker Brothers album from 1978 titled Night Flights. And each of those 4 tracks were very experimental and much different from everything else that he had written in the years leading up to it. And it definitely showed us a new side of Scott Walker that sounded fresh, refined, completely unrestrained, and uniquely original, especially on the track The Electrician, which was written about a CIA torturer. That song is so haunting and dark and just so ahead of its time. So because those 4 originals were the last thing that we had left off on, the anticipation and curiosity were very high for how this album was going to come out, and I think this album is absolutely amazing. I will give this one an S. We have 8 tracks, 7 originals, and 1 cover as the closing track. And the songs on here were recorded very quickly, all happening within the last 6 months of 1983. But the process of writing this album took 6 years, and Scott had been very meticulous about his process and had even said that he needed to go into solitude for a good portion of those 6 years to really let the process play out in as natural of a way as possible. And I think in the end it ended up being completely worth it because I enjoy every single track on here. I think the album is very consistent from front to back. It has a very cohesive mood with songs that are very spacey and dreamlike and oftentimes very ambient and euphoric, utilizing some more electronic sounds. And I'm going to get a little technical here for a second, but the majority of the songs on this album are written around the Lydian mode, which definitely adds to that dreamlike feeling that we get from so many of these songs. I think the production is very good. I love the instrumentation and the different keyboard sounds used throughout, as well as the great orchestration. Scott's vocal work is beautiful. So many amazing and lush melodies. I love the reverb that they use on his voice. And the general mood of the album is pretty spacey and laid back, but we do have a couple of tracks that are a little bit more high energy that balance out the album well, like track 3, which follows up the slower 2 opening tracks, Rawhide and Dealer, as well as track 5 and track 7, which bring the energy up a bit for the second half of the album. The only song that veers from the general mood of this album is the ending track, which is a Tennessee Williams cover of Blanket Royal Blues, which features just Scott on vocals and Mark Knopfler on acoustic guitar. That one takes on more of a jazz blues sort of mood, but it's really nice getting to hear Mark Knopfler in this sort of environment. And I don't mind that song, although it definitely is my least favorite track on here, but I don't think it takes away from the album too much. My 3 favorites on here are Dealer, track 3, and track 6. Dealer has such a serene and euphoric mood to it with such beautiful vocal melodies. Track 3 has a really great energy to it, and once again, amazing vocal parts from Scott. And track 6 features all of the same things that I just mentioned, but I also particularly love the atonal dissonant saxophone parts that come in as the backdrop to the song halfway through. It always reminds me of those eerie string parts in the background of It's Raining Today, except with a saxophone instead, which I really love. So amazing album and a very solid comeback. And a great record to put out there to continue off of the momentum that he had established from Night Flights, and to also set a framework for his future albums that will continue to push boundaries and stretch barriers to levels that we could never anticipate. So awesome album. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have his 12th studio album from 1995 titled Tilt, the first of 3 albums that he will release over the next 17 years, which are referred to as the Trilogy. This is an album that was 11 years in the making, although most of it was written between 1991 and 1992. After Climate of Hunter, Scott had decided to stop music for a bit and concentrate more on painting and drawing, and eventually he would get back into making music, which would culminate into this album. And I absolutely love this one. This one gets an easy S, and this is probably my second favorite Scott Walker album after Scott 3. I think my number 2 changes sometimes depending on what mood I'm in, but this one pretty consistently shows up as my number 2 favorite. Stylistically, this one feels like it picks up from Climate of Hunter, but builds off of it into this completely new territory that is unlike anything that anyone has heard before. It's an extremely dark album, but Scott had always said that you need to balance out the darkness by approaching it from a humorous place or incorporating humorous elements within it. And he has said that there is a lot of dark humor in these next 3 albums, which some people might be shocked to hear, but it is there if you listen for it. It opens up with the very epic and haunting song Farmer in the City, establishing a really dark tone for the album with Scott's eerie vocals and the really intense violin parts. And it builds really nicely for about 5 minutes and then eventually reaches this beautiful climax and then comes back down. Truly a journey of a song that is the perfect opening track to establish this new Scott Walker sound. Track 2 is titled The Cockfighter, and this takes a completely different turn and builds into this really aggressive and intense drum part. I have no idea what they're using to achieve that really high-pitched sound, but it sounds so wild and very intense. And it definitely hurt my ears when I first listened to this song and I didn't see that part coming. And some of these mysterious sounds are part of the allure of this album. A lot of the sounds on here, I have no idea how they're getting achieved, but I appreciate that element of this album so much. And putting a song like this as track 2 is really telling the listener that this album is going to be unlike anything that you've heard before. I love all the different drum and bass grooves throughout this one too, and I will say this album has some seriously groovy moments in the midst of all this craziness and all this experimentation. There are so many moments in these songs where we have these really nice grooves between the drums and bass. Then for track 3 we go to Bouncer See Bouncer, another song with really wild percussive elements to it that I don't quite understand, that high-pitched glassy noise in the background creating this really eerie backdrop. And then the song suddenly takes this detour into this really beautiful and dreamy sounding section with strings and harp. And to me, I've always considered this section to be the Scott 3 moment of this album. I think this is the closest thing on this album to sounding like late 60s Scott. And then after that, we have my favorite song on here, Manhattan. This song has everything in it. Really cool instrumental parts, powerful Scott vocal parts, groovy bass and drum parts, and really dark and ominous chord changes as well. I really love the groove in the final minute of this song between the drums and bass, just very chill and really great hits. I think if I was going to introduce somebody to this album and show them one track, I think this song would be the perfect choice. Then after that, we have Face on Breast, a song that has some really dark and mysterious elements to it, and it really takes its time. Another great bass line as well, as we're seeing pop up all throughout this album. And then we have Bolivia 95, another spacey song that takes a lot of twists and turns. It starts out more mellow and mysterious and eventually builds into another really groovy drum and bass part with these amazing synth sounds providing the spacey backdrop to the groove. Then we have my second favorite track on here titled Patriot, a single. To me, this song has some of the most beautifully intense moments of the album. The chord voicings in the string sections are so lush against Scott's vocals, and then when that groove comes in, it feels so nice and so satisfying. And once again, a very cool rhythmic part between the drums and bass. And these moments are just happening all throughout this album, one of my favorite elements to this album. Then we have the title track, Tilt. This song is such a banger, really dark and mysterious with this great groove, and sometimes this song has even given me hints of like a Jeff Buckley song. I feel like I could picture a groove like this in a Jeff Buckley song. But this song goes so hard, and it is a great second to last track to set up the ending of the album with the final track, Rosary, which is just Scott singing and playing electric guitar by himself, and I absolutely love this song. Hearing Scott in an environment like this at this point in his career is such a treat, and I love the video of him doing it live on YouTube. The song is so haunting and eerie with some really dissonant guitar parts, and I just love the way it concludes this very dark and intense album. So like I said, this is probably my second favorite Scott Walker album. I love every single track on here. I don't think it has a dull moment. And I love how Scott picked up from Climate of Hunter and brought us into this completely new territory, which he will even further expand upon in his next album. So amazing album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have his 13th studio album from 2006 titled The Drift. This album is the second installment of his trilogy, and it was also his first record for the 4AD record label, which seemed like the perfect fit for an artist like Scott. And I'm going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album. And once again, he took some of the foundational elements that he had left off on with Tilt and then brought it to a completely different level and went even deeper into the trenches of the darkness with so many mesmerizing and intense sounds using a wide variety of different instruments and objects. And I find that this album has a very fascinating dichotomy between Scott's vocal work and then the music underneath it, because a lot of Scott's vocals on this always have a very clear melody to them, but underneath it we have these instrumental parts that feature a lot of textures and blocks of sound, which are oftentimes very dissonant and borderline atonal. And that's one element that I've always found very fascinating about this album. And I will say, this album has some of the most terrifying music that I've ever heard. We have 10 songs, and we open up with Cossacks Are, probably the most badass opening song of any Scott Walker record, in my opinion. It has such a great groove to it, and it's very dissonant with the tritone interval providing that quarter note groove, a song that is easily in my top 10 favorite Scott Walker tracks. Then after that, we have the longest track on the album, titled Clara, coming in at almost 13 minutes in length. A very haunting song that takes us through this very unpredictable journey with lots of jumps and dynamics and really eerie and dissonant string parts getting held out. At about 5 minutes in, the song sort of climaxes into this dreamy tonal section that always reminds me of Climate of Hunter, which I love. I also really love the female vocal feature on this one as well. And in general, I think Scott is really good at writing these longer tracks that take us through so many different twists and turns. And I think it's a great follow-up to the opening track. Then we have Jesse, which is one of the earliest tracks that he wrote for this album, writing it very shortly after September 11th, 2001. Another very spacey and dark opening that eventually builds into this really intense string part. I love the way that it climaxes into the second section, definitely one of the scarier moments on this album, in my opinion. And then after that, we have my second favorite track on here, titled Jolson and Jones. This song has such a cool and eerie groove to it, and Scott's vocal work on this one is so haunting, but also very catchy at the same time. For whatever reason, I always get the main vocal part of this song stuck in my head. So another example where I feel like the vocal work on this is very melodic, and it has a lot of just really clear melodies that he's outlining that oftentimes I get stuck in my head a lot. And it's another one of those songs that takes us through such an intense journey that eventually leads to Scott saying, "I'll punch a donkey in the streets of Galway." So maybe that's one little spot where you can find some of the dark humor throughout these albums. And then we have another longer track coming in at 10.5 minutes titled Q. And this song, I have to say, has one of the most terrifying musical moments that I've ever heard. When I first listened to this album, I had headphones on, and around 5 minutes in, this huge string section comes in, and when I first heard that, it completely threw me off guard, and I jumped and my heart skipped a beat. It was one of the most intense things that I've ever heard. It just sounds insane. It sounds like some sort of really chaotic siren going off. It's just so anxiety-provoking and so intense. I love it so much. And then we have another amazing song called Hand Me Ups, another one that has a really heavy drum groove, and instrumentally this one could pass as a metal song. It goes so hard. And then he brings things down a bit after that with Buzzers, another very spacey song that starts with minimal instrumentation, just this glassy sort of percussion sound and a little bit of guitar, and eventually it works in some bass and what sounds to be like the strings of a piano, which creates a really cool effect. I love how adventurous the instrumentation is throughout this album. After that, we have Psoriatic, a very cool song that starts out probably on one of the most tonal sections of the album. We get a little groove in the bass, but then it veers into some really wild and tonally ambiguous territories, and it follows that outline throughout the song. After that, we have The Escape, which I would say is probably one of the bleakest and eeriest songs on the album, with this really dark and dissonant chord progression, and it maintains that bleakness for a bit, and then it brings in this quick anxiety-provoking section followed by some strings that drop down into Scott just singing by himself with the acoustic guitar doing this really dissonant chord progression. And then that leads into one of the most terrifying moments of the album, where we hear "What's Up, Doc" being repeated over and over again with this really demonic sounding voice. Just such an intense and truly terrifying musical moment, and this album is just filled with moments like that. One of the reasons why I find this album so thrilling to listen to. And then similar to Tilt, we conclude on a song that is just guitar and vocals. It starts out fairly tonal, and then it goes into these very unsettling guitar chords. A nice chill way to wrap up the album, but still containing that eerie element and ending on a really dissonant chord voicing. It sounds like an augmented chord or something along the lines of that. So just a masterpiece of an album, and one of those albums that is really hard to put into words. You really need to just listen to it and experience it yourself for what it is. I sort of alternate between Tilt and this one as my second favorite album, depending on what mood I'm in. But I think I tend to find Tilt a little bit more easy to listen to on a regular basis, whereas this album, I really have to be prepared for what I'm about to be getting into. But it's just an absolutely incredible album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, now we have his 14th and final studio album from 2012 titled Bish Bosh, and this was also the concluding album to his trilogy, which also included Tilt and The Drift. And I'm going to give this one an S. Absolutely amazing album and a very powerful piece of work to conclude his solo discography with. I will say that of the trilogy, I do find this album to be the most challenging. I think on this one, he goes even deeper into the depths of what he had established on The Drift. And because of that, I think this album is a pretty intense experience, and I do need to be mentally prepared to take it in. So it's not an album that I can listen to on a regular basis, but it does have a couple of individual tracks that I do listen to fairly regularly. But I certainly appreciate it for what it is, and when I do listen to it in its entirety, it always makes for a very intense and powerful experience. It opens up with See You Don't Bump His Head, a great opening track, really aggressive and hard-hitting right off the bat with this powerful recurring bass hit. And Scott's vocals are again very catchy and melodic underneath this backdrop of very tense and totally ambiguous layers of sound. I also really love the addition of the baritone guitar as well. I think it adds a whole nother layer of heaviness to Scott's writing. And we hear that for the first time in this song. As far as I can tell, I don't think he utilized it at all on The Drift. So that was a cool little addition to this album. I was very psyched to hear that for the first time. And then after that, similar to what he does on The Drift, he follows the opening track with a 10-minute long song. This one is titled Corpse de Blah, and I absolutely love this song. Definitely one of my favorite tracks from this album, and I think I like it even more than Clara from The Drift. It's so adventurous and takes us through so many different moods. It's got a little bit of everything. It's got beautiful a cappella ska. It's got some really dark and haunting sections. It has some heavy sections with the baritone guitar. It's got some beautiful magical euphoric sections. And it's got probably one of the clearest examples of the humorous elements that Scott talks about in this music, with the farting sounds and the reference to a sphincter's tooting our tune. I remember when I first heard an interview of Scott talking about how there was humor in a lot of these later albums. This section to this song was like the first thing that came to my mind when he said that, and I think this is probably the most clear example of that humor within these albums. Then we have a hauntingly adventurous song titled Phrasing. Beautiful vocal melodies from Scott, lots of instrument changes, cool feel changes in the drums, and lots of really cool guitar stuff. And in the end, it all culminates into Scott repeating over and over, "Here's to a lousy life." And then after that, we have the longest song that Scott has ever written at almost 22 minutes long. And it has a really complicated title, but in parentheses it says Zircon, a flagpole sitter. I don't like to get too much into the lyrics on some of these later albums because a lot of it can be pretty ambiguous, and Scott has even said himself that he doesn't stick very much to historical fact. He will often just use a general idea to have like a jumping off point into a larger narrative. And Scott had mentioned that he had a friend with a very large library and he would let Scott roam around it. And that was how he discovered and found inspiration for the Zircon character that we hear about in this song. And initially when I put this album on, I was curious what a 22-minute long song written by modern Scott Walker would sound like. And it was certainly very intense and a very haunting and unpredictable experience, which is exactly what I look for in these albums and part of why I like them so much. One part of this song that I particularly love is about 15 minutes in, where we get this temporary moment of tonality with a chord progression and a vocal melody over it. And it feels like a nice brief arrival at some sort of vague resolution that lasts very shortly. And I think adding that little piece to this song adds so much depth to it. Just a really amazing song. But certainly can be a challenging experience at 22 minutes in length. And I would say songs like this are definitely one of the examples why I need to be in a certain mood and be mentally prepared to listen to an album like this. And then after that, we have Epizootics, a very interesting song that establishes this groove centered around the baritone sax, and then eventually it completely leaves that groove and goes in and out of all of these wild sections, utilizing all sorts of interesting instrument combinations, eventually concluding the song with these Hawaiian steel guitars and ukulele. As Scott would describe it, it's like a Hawaiian nightmare. One thing I will say about this song, though, is sometimes it does feel a little long to me. I think it could have been shorter than 9.5 minutes. It sort of drags for me at a certain point, but that's just my opinion. After that, we have Dimple, a very spacey and eerie song with some interesting vocal works throughout. Another weird vocal part that I get stuck in my head a lot is the part in this song where he goes, ink, a dink, a dink. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I get that stuck in my head a lot. But a very cool song, and I like how it starts and ends with the same part, but it has that middle section where it changes things around a bit. And then after that, we have Tar, a song that is poking fun at religious fundamentalism. I really love the string arrangements halfway through this song. I've always wished that I could hear just those string parts on their own. They sound so eerie and sound like they would be perfect for a horror movie. I also love the sword sound serving as the percussive instrument during that short section. I thought that was very cool. And then after that, we have Pilgrim, and this is unfortunately my least favorite track on the album. I do find this song challenging to listen to, mostly from an auditory point of view. It's just a little harsh on the ears, for me at least, but it's only a little under 2.5 minutes long, so it's short-lasted. And then the album ends with an amazing track about the uprising against the communist dictator of Romania, titled The Day the Conducator Died, parentheses, a Christmas song. And the reason why it has a Christmas song in parentheses is because the president of communist Romania and his wife were captured and executed on Christmas Day of 1989. And I think this song is the perfect conclusion. It features Scott on guitar, and he also overdubbed some keyboards and percussion. And I've always loved how throughout the trilogy, the final track would always end with just Scott and nobody else. And this song is very hauntingly beautiful and is more adventurous than the previous two closers just due to the fact that he overdubbed on top of it. But great writing, and I absolutely love how it ends with the sleigh bells and the melody to Jingle Bells, ending on the ultimate form of dark humor. And for Scott's personality and his sense of humor, I think it is very fitting that the final musical section of his final solo album be something like this. So all in all, I couldn't be happier with an album like this being Scott's final piece of solo material, and fortunately he would go on to do some other collaborations as well before he passed away, but even if he had done nothing else, I think Bish Bosh would have been an incredible album to finalize his legacy with. So this one gets an easy S. Alright, we did it. We went through all 14 of Scott Walker's studio albums, and I covered a lot of information throughout this, so it is entirely possible that I misspoke or I said something factually incorrect at some point. So if you hear anything that is not right, please feel free to correct me in the comments and I will address it. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Unfortunately, I don't have any friends that are big Scott Walker fans, so I am always happy to nerd out with some fellow Scott Walker heads, and I would love to hear where you rank his albums and where you agree and disagree with me. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you are interested in hearing more of these, I do a lot of tier lists. I try to do at least one every 2 months or so. So feel free to check out the link to my other album ranking videos in the description if you are interested. And yeah, thanks so much again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.